I've been wanting to do this for a long time. And yes, I know I look like I'm a hobo on some kind of a bender, but the bottom line is that I'm on sick leave from my job, and this is something that has been on my mind for a very, very long time. So I was reminded today about the fact that I posted a picture of the masterful novelist William Faulkner, his house. And I had done this 9 years ago. And he's never far from my mind, ever. He is genuinely the greatest writer we have ever had in the history of this country. And it's because of the fact that he was so brave in the 1920s to unabashedly expose the endemic racism that exists in this country. And it is something that has been there since its founding. I mean, think about it. All of the founding fathers were slave owners, and some of them had the decency to go ahead and free their slaves as soon as they signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but most of them didn't. And regardless of whoever tells you anything different, the entire Civil War was about slavery. Period. States' rights were about the right to own slaves. That is exactly what it was about. It was never about anything else. And it is something that has never gone away. Because once the war was won by the Union, it really didn't make any difference. They gave some opportunities to African Americans, but the bottom line is that it really just emboldened the the South in particular to go ahead and to persecute and make the lives of anybody who wasn't white as miserable as humanly possible. So in the 1920s, you get this author named William Faulkner, and he shows up and he just refuses to give any kind of whitewashed, forgive the pun, depiction of what America is. And subsequently, it becomes obvious that he actually was saying, this is the story of the human race. We have always been doing this. We find somebody to persecute, we blame everything on them, and then we go ahead and build laws to unfairly persecute them. We've done it always. It applies to Native Americans, it applies to women, it applies to African Americans, it applies to everybody. And we're still doing it. So, in 1949, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. And it was because of the fact that Malcolm Cowley, went ahead and cobbled together bits and pieces of all of the stuff that he had done and revealed to the rest of the world that he was building a fictional universe. And it was based on where he was from, which was Oxford, Mississippi, which, as I pointed out in the post that I did earlier, is based on what he turned into Jefferson, Mississippi. But the bottom line is that he had been writing this for over 20 years, and there's dozens of novels and there's dozens of short stories, and it's all about this entire fictional universe. We're extremely lucky that he made or was involved with several films that actually depicted this world, so you actually can go out and find them. Intruder in the Dust and The Southerner are the two biggest examples. There are more out there, but those are probably the two best. So what I've been wanting to do is read aloud one of the greatest openings to one of the greatest novels ever written. Certainly one of the greatest I have ever come across. And in all honesty, what it does beggars belief. Backstory. So you can honestly say that William Faulkner is the James Joyce of the United States. There really is nobody else that can stand in the same room with him. At the beginning of the 20th century, 1920s to be specific, there was a movement called modernism. And what it effectively did was it ripped up all the rules about everything to do with art, thought, philosophy. You name it, they tore it up and just said it's not relevant anymore. This had a lot to do with World War I, which effectively destroyed the innocence of an entire generation. It's basically what's going on right now. So COVID-19 is literally just destroying the innocence of an entire generation. So Faulkner was a huge fan of everything that was going on revolving around this. Bizarrely, he really did try to fight in World War I. And the American Air Force basically just said, no, you don't qualify, health reasons, whatever it was. And he went up to Canada and went ahead and joined the Canadian Air Force. And during training exercises, he flew a plane upside down and crashed it into a hangar. The fact he survived is a complete, utter miracle. So he goes back to Mississippi after this, and he goes ahead and claims the fact that he was a war hero. He bought medals and pinned them to himself and would tell all of these made-up stories about the fact that he was just this amazing war hero, which was total nonsense. So, complete whack job, but still settled down and started writing and did things no one in this country has ever done before and no one has ever done since. He was living in an experimental era. He loved James Joyce's Ulysses so much, he forced his wife, his brand new bride, to read it on their honeymoon. She became so tortured by reading it, she tried to drown herself in a lake. No joke. Once you get to the passage I'm actually going to read, he is at the peak of his powers. This is the best novel he wrote. It's not my favorite. It's the one that I don't sort of gravitate towards immediately. But it is definitely the best thing he wrote. And he knew that. When he was writing it, his brother Dean died in a plane crash. And he was absolutely distraught. He couldn't focus on anything. He had no idea what he was going to do with the rest of his life, faced with something like this. And what he did was, he stopped writing the book. And after a while, drinking himself stupid and everything else that came along with just being him, he went ahead and he called up a good friend, Howard Hawks, who is one of the greatest film directors of all time. He invented literally every single Hollywood film, the way it looks, you've ever seen. He did it with the movie Scarface in 1932, The Disgrace of a Nation. And he was a great friend of literary figures. He brought Hemingway and Faulkner together. And they ended up becoming sort of weird enemies because they rivaled each other when it came to sort of literary achievements. Hemingway was by far the more popular of the two, but Faulkner, he knew the fact, was somehow like a greater rival. So they had this bizarre competition with each other. It's really, really strange. But Faulkner went ahead and told him, it's sort of like, I'm mourning my brother's death, and there's all this stuff going on in my life, and I want to go ahead and finish this book, but I have all these problems I can't seem to solve. And so he says, okay, tell me what the problem is. And so Faulkner goes, well, I've got this, and this. And Hawks thinks about it for a second. And he goes, do this, and this, and your book is fixed. So he finished the book. And once he finished it, he walked into his publisher's office, threw the manuscript on the desk, exclaimed, "This is the greatest American novel since Moby Dick," and walked out. And he's right. He's completely right. Number 2 novel in the history of American literature is Moby Dick. Number 1 is this. So, one of the things that you have to remember when reading this book, and please, for the love of God, do not start reading Faulkner with this. It will shred your brain. I have said this again and again and again. I'm not kidding. This is one of the hardest books you will ever try to read. But it makes an incredibly important point. When James Joyce's Ulysses was published in 1922, which is 14 years before this thing. Sorry, it's backwards. It was said by just about everybody at the time, literature is dead. There's nothing left to say. This book has said everything. There's nothing left to do. And Faulkner completely disagreed with that. So what he wrote in his Yoknapatawpha saga goes like this. And this is going to seem weird, but there are basically 4 sentences in the first page. And this is the way Faulkner writes. Also, I have to apologize for the fact that despite having family in Mississippi and this writer becoming completely into focus once I was down there and I visited them for the first time, I do adopt a Southern accent. And I have a feeling I'm going to offend some people in the South, but the bottom line is, every time I read him, this is the voice that pops in my head. So I'm going to read it in that way. From a little after 2 o'clock until almost sundown of the long, still, hot, weary, dead September afternoon, they sat in what Miss Coldfield still called the office, because her father called it that, a dim, hot, airless room with the blinds all closed and fastened for 43 summers, because when she was a girl, someone had believed that light and moving air carried heat, and that dark was always cooler, and which, as the sun shone fuller and fuller on that side of the house, became latticed with yellow slashes full of dust motes, which Quentin thought of as being flecks of the dead old dried paint itself, blown inward from the scaling blinds, as wind might have blown them. There was a wisteria vine, blooming for the first time that summer, on a wooden trellis before one window, into which sparrows came now and then in random gusts, making a dry, vivid, dusty sound before going away. And opposite Quentin, Miss Goldfield, in the eternal black which she had worn for 43 years now, whether for sister, father, or not husband, none knew, sitting so bolt upright in the straight, hard chair that was so tall for her that her legs hung straight and rigid as if she had iron shin bones and ankles, clear of the floor, with that air of impotent and static rage, like children's feet, and talking in that grim, haggard, amazed voice, until at last listening would renege, and hearing sense self-confound, and the long-dead object of her impotent yet indomitable frustration would appear, as though by outraged recapitulation evoked, quite inattentive, and harmless, out of the biting and dreamy and victorious dust. Her voice would not cease, it would just vanish. There would be the dim, coffin-smelling gloom, sweet and oversweet, with the twice-bloomed wisteria against the outer wall by the savage, quiet September sun, unimpacted, distilled, and hyper-distilled, into which came now and then the loud, cloudy flutter of the sparrows like a flat limber stick whipped by an idle boy, and the rank smell of female old flesh, long embattled in virginity, while the wan, haggard face watched him above the faint triangle of lace at wrist and throat from the too tall chair, in which she resembled a crucified child, and the voice not ceasing, but vanishing into, and then out of, the long intervals with a stream, a trickle running from patch to patch of dried sand, and the ghost mused with shadowy docility, as if it were the voice which he haunted where a more fortunate one would have had a house. Out of quiet thunderclap he would abrupt, man, horse, demon, upon a scene peaceful and decorous as a school prize, watercolor, faint, sulphur wreath still in hair, clothes, and beard, with grouped behind him his band of wild niggers with beasts half tamed to walk upright like men, and attitudes wild and reposed, and manacled among them the French architect with his air grim, haggard, and tatterant, immobile, bearded, and hand palm lifted. The horseman sat, behind him the wild blacks, and the captive architect huddled quietly, carrying in bloodless paradox the shovels and picks and axes of peaceful conquest. Then, in the long unamaze, Quentin would seem to watch them overrun suddenly the 100 square miles of tranquil and astonished earth, and drag house and formal gardens violently out of the soundless nothing, and clap them down like cards upon a table, beneath the up-palm immobile and pontific, creating the Sutpins 100, the B Sutpin hundreds, like the olden time B light. Then hearing would reconcile, and he would seem to listen to two separate Quentins now. The Quentin Compson preparing for Harvard in the South, the deep South, dead since 1865, and peopled with garrulous, outraged, baffled ghosts, listening, having to listen to one of the ghosts which had refused to lie still, even longer than most had, telling him about old ghost times, and the Quentin Compson who was still too young to deserve yet to be a ghost, but nevertheless having to be one for all that, since he was born and bred in the deep South, the same as she was, the two separate Quentins now talking to one another in the long silence of not people, in not language like this. It seems that this demon, his name was Sutpin, Colonel Sutpin, who came out of nowhere without warning upon the land with a band of strange niggers and built a plantation, tore violently, a plantation, Miss Rosa Coldfield says, tore violently, and married his sister Ellen, and begot a son and a daughter, which, without gentleness begot, Miss Rosa Coldfield says, without gentleness, which should have been the jewels of his pride and the shield and comfort of his old age, only only they destroyed him or something, or he destroyed them or something and died. And died. Without regret, Ms. Rosa Caulfield says. Saved by her. Yes, saved by her. And by Quentin Compson. Yes, and by Quentin Compson. It is literally saying, there is more to say. Even if we have to speak in the voice of not people and not language, we still have something to say. And so Faulkner put out the case that basically Joyce was wrong. So the most accoladed and praised novel of the 20th century is Ulysses by James Joyce. But what Faulkner is saying is, 14 years after the fact, you were wrong. There's more work to be done. There's more work to say. And I apologize. The fact that he uses the N-word, he gives an unvarnished view of the South. He pulls no punches. And some of his stories are so harrowing and heartbreaking because of the persecution that is depicted about African Americans. This needs to be our national discussion. We don't need to really be talking about anything else, because everything else is about money, bribery, extortion, whatever the hell you want to call it. This is the central discussion. We are a nation founded on this, and we've got to deal with it. George Floyd and all the other endless numbers of racial persecution that have happened in the course of this country's history. That's what this country is about. That's what we are. You can hate it as much as you want. It's not going away. So, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it fascinating. If you're going to start with anything, his short stories are very easy to find, and they give you a definite gateway into all of his work. You can also just start from the beginning. New Orleans Stories is not easy to find, but it's the first major thing he wrote. It lays the foundation for a lot of stuff he did. Soldier's Pay and Mosquitoes come next. Mosquitoes has the distinction of being one of the books that was banned in Boston because it was seen as too lewd. It was being too excessive. Do not read Sargeras, which is, publication-wise, the very first book in this saga in which he is building this entire fictional universe. Read Flags in the Dust. It was restored as that, and that was his original title. That whole process was a total nightmare, and that's the original. So read that. You frankly can skip The Sound and the Fury. It's the most popular book he ever wrote, but it's really flawed. There's really problems with it that just kind of can't really be fixed. As L.A. Dying is one of the greats, but it does have 15 narrators, and you really have to work hard to kind of follow the entire story. It is one of my absolute favorites, and I read it in a day. Sanctuary is frankly the gateway. It has one of the most horrific endings in any book I've ever read. But if you can just cope with that, It is absolutely brilliant, and it is one of the three foundational books that created hard-boiled detective fiction, from which we get film noir. The other two are Red Harvest by Dashiell Hammett and The Postman Always Rings Twice by James M. Cain. But it's a phenomenal book, really brilliant, and it's easily the most accessible thing that he actually wrote. So start with that. If you survive that, then jump on to the rest of them. Leave this one until you actually have some of his work under your belt. Because if you think that was hard to follow, trust me, it doesn't get any easier. But the payoff is unbelievable. Truly one of the greatest books I've ever read in my entire life. I had to read it about 3 or 4 times before I actually figured it out, but it's truly incredible. So, thank you if you listened. Thank you if you enjoyed it. And we'll see if I do another one of these soon. It just happened to be on my mind, and I wanted to share it. So, have a good day. Thank you very much.